So we're back looking at the main line of the site login page. We have finding the file, including the files and the head start and so on. Now, what we want to go to next is the session start. It's got to be the first line of this program. So it's the first line of the main line. That starts a session because we're going to have a session variable now. So let's take a look at what happens. First of all, we say, well, is there a session variable? The name of the session variable is going to be site member. So is set session site member is just checking to see whether or not the session variable exists. And we have an else all set up if it doesn't exist. But let's assume for the moment it does. Let's see what we do. Well, first of all, we're going to take that session variable and we're going to unserialize it. That unserializing takes it from, it's set up as a string of properties and values that it can then be used to repopulate the site member object. So that's what we have set up here. You notice I have site member with a capital M. That's different from site member with a lowercase m, obviously. I could have named it anything. Now once I have that, I'm going to test whether or not it's a valid user. If you're not a valid user, we've already seen that function, then we're going to echo an error message and stop the program if they're not a valid user. However, let's assume they are a valid user. We're going to then say, okay, well, all we really did is test the username and password. So now we have to see if there's been any updates to their first name, last name, and role. You'll notice the function here is called get user details, where we send the username and the password and the field, fname. Let's take a look at that function. So we have the username, password, and the field. We begin answer goes NA, just in case by default we don't get what we were looking for. And then we have an SQL statement, select field from site users where email equals this and password equals that. We prepare that statement. We bind the parameters of the username and the encrypted password. We execute it, we store the result, and then we bind the result to field, $ field, which we then fetch and return. So that's what's going to happen. In this example, I didn't actually use the default ANS value. If there wasn't something to fetch, then it should have returned that. So we get our user details for fname, lname, and user role. At that point, now I have a comment here. I sometimes have something like a welcome, just particularly during the testing phase of this, just to see whether it works or not. You see I've commented that out. At which point, I then, since I have this object all set, I convert it to a string. I serialize it. And at that point, I can then reassign the session site member variable the value equal to the current string, the str site member. That way, if I had a session variable and it's valid, it updates any first name, last name, and role, and then resaves the session variable. Now let's go to the else if there was no session. Then it says, well, is there a cookie? Is set cookie site member? We haven't looked at cookies yet, but we will. So if there is one, we're basically going to do the same thing. We're going to unserialize the cookie, and then we're going to test and see whether it's valid. If it's not valid, we're going to give an error message and stop the program. However, if it is valid, it will then update the user details on fname, lname, and user role. And at that point, it will serialize, turning it back into a string, and save it now as a session variable. So if there was a cookie variable, it only checks out if there wasn't a session variable, and if there was a cookie variable, it then creates a session variable. And again, for testing purposes, I'd put something else in there just to test it out, but I've commented that now. So let's go to the else. There's no cookie variable and there's no session variable. So if there's not any post data, what are we going to do? We're going to get the user information and stop the program there. We're just going to put that form out there. That's if there's no post data. Of course, if there is some post data, that's when we only get here if you have sent some post data. Well, we've already previously seen what we're going to do with that. We have, if there's a new account, we're going to do this. If there's not a new account, we're going to do that. We've already seen all that. So we just got to incorporate this all together.